We are now going to turn to our first reading, the Meno by Plato. Part of what we do in a philosophy course such as this is that we learn how to read carefully. When dealing with a text, you should keep in mind the time it was written and the language in which it was written. To state an obvious but important point, the Meno was written in Greek. It is probably one of Plato's earlier dialogues. This is a bit debated, and it was written perhaps around the year 390 before the Common Era, or perhaps a bit before even. Plato did not have in mind, as his potential readers, 21st century Americans, but 4th century before the Common Era Greeks, and more specifically Athenians. Hence, when reading the text, you should keep in mind the context of the author and whom the author saw as his potential readers. You might very well protest that you don't know any Greek, nor know well enough the culture of ancient Greece to be able to understand the significance of the context. This is definitely a valid objection. However, by doubting your initial interpretation and your suppositions, you will already penetrate more deeply into the text. Just don't assume that the author is saying exactly what you would say or expect in the similar context. Moreover, that is the whole point of these brief videos that I'm going to provide you with right now, and also my lecture notes. They should help you have insights into the cultural elements that you will need in order to fully understand the dialogue of Plato, Meno. Now, Meno is a famous dialogue, but a rather peculiar one. It begins with a question: is virtue something taught, something natural, or something acquired through practice? To which it provides only a tentative answer. It seems sometimes even to get a bit off topic. What is Plato trying to do in this dialogue? I think, it's very interesting. I think this dialogue actually operates at three distinct levels. The dialogue might very well represent a real dialogue in this case, which Plato observed directly. Now, this is controversial. Not all commentators think that this has any support. The historical Meno, however, was something of an adventurer and a mercenary general who became involved in wars in Persia and was captured and executed around the year 400 before the Common Era. Before journeying to Asia Minor with a mercenary army, he came to Athens to recruit soldiers, and he was in Athens in the year 402 before the Common Era. One of the soldiers that he recruited was a man named Xenophon, a close associate and friend of Socrates. Now, if Meno talked with Xenophon, Socrates almost assuredly would have been present. Plato was about 25 years old at the time, and it's quite likely that Plato would have been present as well. So we can place Meno and Socrates in Athens in 402 BC, and with Plato likely being in audience as well. So there's a real conversation lurking around here, and I think some of this is going to reflect that. The latter part, however, when the third character, Anytus, becomes involved in the dialogue, is more likely fictive. That would be less likely that he was actually present. So what we are reading, I think, reflects some of the roughness of a real conversation. Yet Socrates, this is the second level now, Socrates had a specific purpose in his conversation with Meno. And this brings us to the most important part of the text, and the reason that I choose to teach Meno as the first text in an introduction to philosophy course, as well as many other philosophy professors throughout the country do the same. Socrates is not too sure of the answer to Meno's question, but he is sure that Meno will never understand anything about the problem of teaching virtue as long as Meno is confident of already having the truth. The first order of business is to show Meno that he does not understand the issue at hand as well as he believes, and to create doubt in his mind. Socrates has to bring Meno to a state where he is receptive to learning, which is not the case at the beginning of the dialogue. This is the true sense of the dialogue and is the most important part of it. Without doubt and a bit of befuddlement, one cannot be taught anything. It is a common misinterpretation that Socrates is merely playing with Meno's mind. That is not what he is doing. He's bringing out the consequences of Meno's view and ultimately showing that they are untenable. The third way of reading the text is simply following the line of argument itself. It is full of fascinating points, and quite a bit of my notes will be spent elucidating these. As you go through the dialogue, I want you to grasp the benefit that comes to us from doubt. In pop culture, doubt is sometimes considered something negative, nonsense. If you're going to be educated, doubt is your friend, confidence is your enemy. The first part of the Socratic dialectic recognizes this and brings people to where they have doubt so that they may learn. As a teacher, there's not much you can do with somebody who is confident of already having the truth. In Buddhism, they have a nice way of describing such a person. They say that they say about such a person that his cup is already full. If a cup is full, you cannot add anything more. The first part of the Socratic dialectic involves emptying some of the contents of the cup to make room for learning. There's another underlying theme to the dialogue, and this is the general attempt to understand where knowledge comes from. Following the Persian Wars of the early 5th century before the Common Era, the Greeks are beginning to realize that they have real advantages over other civilizations. This isn't just your standard chauvinism. All civilizations tend to be chauvinistic, in fact. The Greeks, however, are becoming somewhat less chauvinistic at this time and learning to appreciate the greatness of other civilizations. In mathematics, in banking techniques that underlie international trade, in military prowess, and I would argue even in art, the Greeks are pulling ahead. In the 4th century before the Common Era, they are going to explode over the whole eastern Mediterranean with the conquest of Alexander the Great and come to create Greek-speaking empires stretching from southern Italy up until what is today Pakistan. The logistics of those conquests requires excellent mathematics. Having brave soldiers fight a battle is one thing. Feeding and supplying an army over such a long campaign is quite another. Let me give you just one example to illustrate the advantages of Greek art or some of the things that the Greeks are doing in art. There's many, many examples I can give. I'm just going to restrict myself to one. When you look at the columns of other civilizations, there's something kind of annoying that you notice about them. The Egyptian columns, for example, is that they tend to flare outwards. They look a little bit crooked. They don't appear to us to be straight. On the other hand, when you look at the columns of the Greek Acropolis, they appear to us to be perfectly straight. Why is that? Well, the funny point about this is that the Egyptian columns are, in fact, straight, but to the human eye, they will appear to flare outwards given the way that we perceive them. The Greek columns, on the other hand, are all bent. They're all bent at a slightly different angle so that the human eye perceives them as straight. Kind of a fun little twist. Now, most of the knowledge and art in Greece is being done by Athens. Athens is the real key city-state leading to the flowering of Western philosophy, science, and mathematics. Why Athens? I think we can answer that, though it is a bit speculative. An isolated civilization is going to be stagnant. One that has a lot of contact with other civilizations will be dynamic. Athens has very little grain. It cannot feed its population of some 200,000 people from its agricultural hinterland. However, it has a good seaport. It has good clay soil to make pottery. The famous vases of ancient Greece are typically Athenian. It has olives and hence olive oil. It has vines, hence it has grapes and wine. And it has a very rich silver mine. The result is that the Athenians are trading all over the Mediterranean and even throughout the Black Sea in order to feed themselves. They have these luxury items, they have wealth, but in order to get the foodstuffs that they need, they're going to have a lot of trade. They have extensive contacts with the Egyptians, with the Babylonians, with the Persians, and other great civilizations. Where you have trade, ideas will also be exchanged. I would argue that one of the main reasons that the great flowering of Western philosophy, science, and mathematics happened in Athens and at this time is because of the cross-fertilization of ideas from other civilizations. There are economic and political issues tied into this as well. But the general point is important. Openness to other civilizations is a path to greatness. Finally, don't underestimate Meno. He was a successful mercenary general, even if he was ultimately killed by treachery after a successful battle. When he says that he has given many fine speeches about virtue, he is referring to the encouragement that he gives soldiers before joining battle to get them to basically valiantly perform their duty. Plato's target audience would know these details and would have a good deal of respect for the historical Meno. Good luck in the reading. After you finish the reading, please look at my lecture notes to complete this part of the assignment.